Good afternoon and welcome back to our third lecture on how we got the Bible. Today we're going to be looking at the ancient translations of the New Testament. If you remember, you could also call these the ancient versions of the New Testament, since a version is something that's translated from the original language into another language. Also recall the word revision is an updating of an older version. That word will pop up a couple times in the lecture. But before we start talking about some of the specific documents that have historical significance, that have significance to reconstructing the original wording of the Greek text, we need to appreciate some introductory information as well as the significance of the translations. Because the translations are indeed not the original form that the text is written in, they're not in the original language, that is, they're going to have a secondary significance to the question, what did Paul and Peter and John actually write? What's the word order of the text they actually wrote? Did they say Jesus Christ? Did they say Christ Jesus? And those kinds of questions. So they will be of secondary importance, the second rank, in contrast to the texts that are actually in Greek. However, these are ancient translations, many of them being very close to the original writing. We'll be looking at three of the translations today, but there are quite a few. You have translations of the New Testament into Latin, into Coptic, into Syriac, into Ethiopic, into Gothic, into Armenian, as well as other languages. But the big three are the Latin, the Syriac, and the Coptic. And that's because those are probably the oldest translations of the New Testament into any other language. But when you compile all of the different translations, all of the ancient manuscripts, again, handwritten documents, you get around 18,000 copies of the New Testament or New Testament books. When you combine the Greek text, that puts you close to 24,000 copies of the New Testament or New Testament books from the ancient world. And that number alone is staggering because it says there is something significant about the New Testament documents. There's something special that would move people to copy and translate and continue copying over and over and over again so that you have tens of thousands of these. On top of that, the implication is that if we found that many, that there probably were more that were copied or translated that have disintegrated over time or just have been lost. In fact, we might find more as time goes on, but it does suggest that there's something significant about that New Testament text itself. Now let's jump into looking at some of the important historical documents. The first one I want to talk about is what's called the Syriac diatessaron. So the word diatessaron simply means through the four. It's actually a harmony of the four Gospels, probably written in Syriac originally. There is a debate, was it originally written in Greek? And we're not sure on that. But it's not a true translation in the sense that someone's going to sit down and translate Matthew and someone's going to sit down and translate Mark, because a guy named Tatian, around 170 AD, actually took the four Gospels and made a single harmonious story from the four accounts. He combined all of that into one continuous account. People have done that in English today. And so, in that sense, it's not a true translation, but he was using the gospel content to arrange this book. It became very popular in the Syrian churches, to the point that some Syrian bishops decided that they needed to make a special effort to stop the Syrian churches from using them so that they'd only use Matthew and Mark and John and not this harmony. In fact, what's pictured there is not actually a Syriac or even Greek version of it, because there aren't basically any copies of the diatessaron. In fact, at one point, some scholars were debating on whether it ever actually existed, because we only know about it from commentaries and letters primarily. But this is an Arabic translation from around the 11th century. What is more plentiful in the Syriac language is what we call the Peshitta, but before we get to that, I want to talk about the Old Syriac. The Old Syriac has two major manuscripts. One manuscript is called the Curetonian, and it came from a monastery near Cairo, and it's from around the 5th century AD. And up until the Curetonian was found and translated, the scholarly world really didn't realize there was an Old Syriac. They knew about the Peshitta, but they didn't really realize the Old Syriac was a separate entity in the history of the Syriac translation of the New Testament. So the Curetonian manuscript was very important in that discovery and realization, oh, there is actually a separate translation that has existed. Also in that family of Old Syriac is what's called the Sinaitic manuscript. If you remember St. Catherine's from the last lecture, where the Codex Sinaiticus was found, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and then also the Greek New Testament. Same place, different people find what's called the Sinaitic Syriac manuscript, and it's from the 4th or 5th century AD. 4th century being 300s, 5th century being 400s. We have not very many copies of the Old Syriac. We pretty much just have those two manuscripts. But the Peshitta, we have about 350 copies of those. The word Peshitta simply means simple. So apparently this was intended to be a simple Syriac translation so people could read and understand the New Testament. And I should have mentioned earlier, but the Syriac language is very similar to Aramaic and very similar to Hebrew. They were all sister languages of each other. So a Jew could, for the most part, understand Syriac if he understood Hebrew, or someone who spoke Aramaic could understand Syriac for the most part. And this was the standard Syriac text from the 5th century onward. And apparently it was a revision of the Old Syriac. The Old Syriac apparently is similar to the Western family of text. It does have some Alexandrian readings in some places, but apparently is mostly Western, while the revision, the Peshitta, is apparently a revision based on the Byzantine family, an early version of the Byzantine-type text that we know from the Constantinople area. The next language we wanted to talk about was the Coptic language. Coptic is a version of Egyptian, but it uses Greek letters. So Greek hieroglyphics is really a pictograph language. The pictures represent ideas. Greek letters were a phonetic language. The letters represent sounds, not ideas themselves. And so of the Coptic, there are several dialects. In fact, the picture that is on the screen right now is a picture of the Codex Geisler, which is a manuscript of Acts. It's in a different dialect of Coptic than really the ones we're talking about today, because we're going to talk about the Sahidic dialect, which is from southern Egypt. The main city of southern Egypt was Thebes, and we have extensive documents from the 3rd and 4th century. Again, that's being 200s, 300s in relation to the Greek New Testament. Again, these are Coptic, but they are translated from the Greek Testament. We also have a Bohairic dialect of the Coptic language. It was the dialect of northern Egypt, whose main city was Alexandria, and we don't have quite as many, but we have some manuscripts from the 4th and 5th century related to the New Testament, or copies of the New Testament. And the reason these two dialects are so important is, one, they're relatively early, 200s, 300s AD, and they both support the readings of Codex Vaticanus, which we talked about last week, and Codex Sinaiticus. They seem to be translations from Greek texts of that family, of that tradition, which means all the way over here in Egypt are manuscripts or copies of manuscripts that are very, very similar to the copies used to create the Codex Vaticanus as well as Codex Sinaiticus. The last language we wanted to talk about today was Old Latin. We'll probably spend more time on this because it is possibly the most important translation for Bible history of the New Testament ever made. So you first have the Old Latin. Around 180 AD, you have a persecution that happens in Cilium, which is a small town in the area of Numidia in North Africa. There was a record of this persecution where Christians were arrested and tried and beheaded. But one man who was tried, his name is Spiritus, is asked what he's carrying in a chest. And he replies, the letters of Paul, a just man. According to Lightfoot, it's very unlikely that the people of Cilium knew Greek. Most likely, they knew Latin and maybe another language, but Greek was not likely the language of most people, which suggests that in this chest that Spiritus has as he's under trial is copies of the letters of Paul in Latin. And if copies of the letters of Paul exist in Latin, it's very likely that the Gospels also existed in Latin. And this is probably part of what's called the Old Latin. So these were probably copied by individuals, translated by individuals, and then copied by other people to help local teachers and local evangelists share the gospel. And maybe as early as 160 AD. Now recall, the Bible was finished by 100 AD. be referring to the New Testament. New Testament documents are all written by 100 AD. The Latin translations possibly start popping up as early as 160, again, probably by individuals. And so because of that, that creates an environment where all these different Old Latin manuscripts will read a little bit differently because one person translates a version of 1 Corinthians, another person translates Matthew, another person translates Mark. And so you have these slightly different translations because people chose to use different words when they translated into Latin. What's pictured here is what's called Codex Vercellenensis. It is possibly the oldest codex we have of the Gospels in Old Latin. This situation of these different translations that vary from place to place because they were individuals and not a committee develops a situation where a bishop decides there needs to be an official translation. This is what is eventually going to become known as the Latin Vulgate. The word Vulgata simply means common. If you think of a word vulgar, it means common. So Vulgata just means a common or accepted. And so Damasus is a bishop of Rome. And around 382 AD, he decides that there is a need for a unified version of the Old Latin. That there's all of these different translations that they need to come up with an official version that can be used in the worship services, that can be used to teach. And he commissions a guy named Eusebius Hieronymus, or we know as Jerome, to do so. He tells Jerome, I want you to revise the Old Latin. So you have the version of the Old Latin, the translations in the Old Latin, and he asks Jerome to create a revision to develop an official translation. And this eventually becomes known as what we call Jeromes Vulgate. Now, we know Jerome revised the 4 Gospels. We're not sure if he got to revise the letters of Paul and the letters of Peter and the rest of the New Testament. We know he revised the 4 Gospels. But Jerome was an excellent scholar. He studied the text, and even though he's doing a revision, he wanted his Latin to conform to the original Greek. And so he is studying Greek text. He is studying the older copies of the Bible to try to make sure that his Latin version is going to be as close as possible to the original Greek that was written by the apostles. Because of this, especially in the Gospels, his Gospels appear very, very much like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. It's the same kind of readings, the same kind of terminology. And we'll look at some examples again in the next lecture to give you an idea of the variance you occasionally see in the Greek text. And so the fact that his pretty early copy, 380 AD, of the Gospels, his translation, is very similar to Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, suggests those are good readings. However, and it seems that Jerome expected this, he was met with intense opposition. There were a lot of people who didn't like his Latin translation. In fact, in his preface, in his introduction to his Latin translation of the Gospels, which he dedicates to Damasus, who's commissioned him, he actually writes a note about how people are going to receive this, and they're going to see him as arrogant, and they're going to see him as being presumptuous to add to and change the words of Jesus and the apostles. And he basically makes the point that his goal is to revise it according to the original wording. Not that he's trying to change what they're saying, simply that he wants it to conform to original Greek. Despite that explanation, he is met with intense opposition. And he spends a lot of his life in conflict for that reason, because people, as he says in a very snarky way, Lightfoot notes this in his book, if they don't like drinking from a clear stream, then let them drink from muddy waters, referring to them reading the Old Latin translations as opposed to reading his new translation of the Gospels. For the Latin Vulgate, there's a couple really important documents that we have still in existence today. One is called Codex Amiatinus. That is a picture of the 4 evangelists at the start of the New Testament in that version. Because again, today we're focusing on the New Testament, but the Latin Vulgate did eventually also include the Old Testament, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the translations of the Old Testament. But it is probably the oldest complete version of the Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate has about 10,000 copies in existence. It was one of the first important books printed on the printing press. It is the most copied document in biblical history. Anything that refers to the Bible or any copies of the Bible, it is the one that's been copied the most. It's basically double the ones we found of the Greek, right? 5,600 of the Greek text, 10,000 of the Latin. It's also really significant for English speakers because the Roman Catholic Church has such a large hold on the Western world, and the Latin Vulgate eventually becomes the official translation of the Roman Catholic Church. It's actually still the official translation of the Roman Catholic Church. And the very first Bibles that were translated into English were translated from the Latin because those were the documents that were available. In fact, a Catholic Bible, a Catholic English translation, is not translated from the Greek. It is translated from the Latin Vulgate. This is very important for English speakers, and many people don't realize how big an influence the Latin Vulgate has had on their own biblical history. In fact, a lot of words we use in English, like congregation and sanctification, are influenced from the Latin Vulgate because of the influence of Latin on our English language. So this is one of the oldest copies, the Codex Amiatinus. It's probably written, copied around 700 AD, very likely at Wearmouth or Jarrow, England. And it is a good example of these copies were often decorated with beautiful pictures that someone took a lot of time and invested a lot of energy into because of the value that they placed in these scriptures, the value they placed in this. So you have Codex Amiatinus. You also have the Lindisfarne Gospels. So it also was probably copied around 700 AD, probably in Lindisfarne, Ireland, probably by the monks there. And I want to tell a quick story about this text. It's pretty interesting to me. It's an example of how amazing it is that anything from the ancient world has made it to the modern world, that has survived until then. And so in 793, the Lindisfarne monastery is sacked by Vikings. Vikings raided Ireland. They also occasionally raided England, causing lots of problems for these monks that were isolated in these abbeys. And so in 875 AD, eventually the monks have enough of being raided and sacked by the Vikings, and they flee. They run away from Lindisfarne. And part of what they do is they take these manuscripts, including this document. However, on their escape, as they're on their boat, they're caught in a storm, and this document is swept overboard and into the sea, presumably to be lost forever at that point. Amazingly, later on, a couple of the monks were walking on the beach, and they find this document washed up on shore, still intact, still in relatively good shape. Again, it is amazing that this document it remains in existence today. It also has a word-for-word Anglo-Saxon translation between the lines that was probably written around 950 AD, one of those earliest efforts to bring the Bible into some form of English. And we'll talk more about that in the last lecture. We talk about the history of the English Bible. The final book we're going to look at today is what's called the Book of Kells. And in the Book of Kells, is considered possibly the most beautiful book ever to have been made. Probably copied around 800 AD, but we're not certain. That's why I have a question mark there. We're not absolutely positive if that's the case. We think it was copied by monks from Iona, but this page is the beginning of John. And you have pages and pages and pages in this book that are just gorgeous, and lots of effort and energy went into creating these very decorated and beautiful pictures. A lot of book scholars view this as one of the wonders of the ancient world, one of the wonders of book scholarship because of its beauty. It is located in Kells now, and it was possibly mentioned early on. A traveler to Kells mentions this amazing book. It's very possible that's the one he is referring to. Now, these are just a couple examples of the important, significant books from each of these three languages, from the Coptic, the Syriac, and the Latin. And I hope that this lecture has been insightful, has given you some things to think about. And of course, there's far more manuscripts you could talk about. You could spend your whole life and not know everything there is to know about the Greek manuscripts, as well as the translations. Next time, we will talk more about the process of taking the translations and taking the original Greeks, and then how do you reconstruct the Greek text so that we can then translate it into other languages, including English.